A few years ago, there was an author named J. Elliott Corbett who wrote a book called The Prophets on Main Street. And what he tried to do was to capture the essence of each one of the minor prophets in their message. And for Amos, he chose the section that we just talked about, where Amos pronounces judgment on surrounding nations and then on Israel itself. In Corbett's book, he uses nations that used to be the enemies of America, like Germany and Japan and Russia. Of course, Russia's now a little bit of our enemy again. But he saves his harshest condemnation. The book was written during the Cold War, so you can understand the language, but saves his harshest condemnation for America. And this is what he says. He says, "For 3 transgressions of America, and for 4, I will not turn it back. I hear your songs of self-praise. I listen to your criticism of others. But though I remove the wax from my straining ears, I cannot hear your voice raised in self-judgment or repentance. For you trusted in the makers of the atom bomb, but not in the maker of the atom." Taking a play from Amos's words and aiming it towards America. Well, in chapter 3, as I mentioned, this is where the oracle of Israel's election really becomes clear. Because it refers to the Exodus and how the Exodus was the central event, and it shows that God elected them and that this gave Israel a unique relationship with him. But that doesn't exclude them from judgment. What that means is that God has a special judgment for Israel because of the unique relationship. And so just some implications from this, after God saying, "You only have I chosen," in 3:2, is that election implies obligation as well as privilege. Israel thought that because they had this unique relationship with God, that exempted them from judgment. And God says that's really not the case. It really is the other way around, that I have a special judgment for you because of your election. And ultimately, those who are elected are more accountable and may receive a greater judgment. Jesus said in Luke 12:48 that everyone who has been given much, much will be demanded. And from the one who has been entrusted with much, much more will be asked. It's also what Peter Parker's Uncle Ben was trying to tell him when he dropped him off at the library that day in the original Spider-Man. With great power comes great responsibility. And Israel was expected to do more because they were God's special people. And election does not guarantee unlimited blessing, as Israel thinks that it has. Well, I had to skip some really good stuff in there. Pay special attention to Amos's section on the cows of Bashan, referring to these large oppressive women. But we need to talk about this section because it's one of the most notable parts of Amos. When Amos begins by calling the people in a sarcastic call to worship, and he invites them to come to church and sin. Probably would not have made the best greeter at the front door of a church. Enter Bethel and transgress. Enter Gilgal and multiply transgression as you come forward to make your offerings in your religiosity. Ultimately, God hates their worship. He despises the things that they're doing in worship because their actions outside of worship do not match their actions inside of worship. And so he lists all of these aspects of worship, and these are mandated acts of worship. In other words, these were things that they were commanded to do. But God hates them because they're not living that way outside of their worship. He rejects them because what he really wants is for them to be just and righteous. And so this leads us to one of the most familiar passages in Amos, made famous by many people, including Dr. Martin Luther King. When God says, "Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not even listen to the sound of your harps. but let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. God wants his people to do the right thing and to be just and righteous. Well, the last section that we are going to look at in Amos, and there's a lot of good stuff in between, so don't feel like you should look at it. We just don't have time to talk about it here. The very last few verses of Amos, where he predicts a new day for Israel. He predicts that the Davidic dynasty is going to be revived and restored, that God is going to bring it back. And he uses the nation of Edom to represent all of the nations that Israel will possess. In that day, God says, I will raise up the fallen booth, some translations say tent, of David, and wall up its breaches, and raise up its ruins, and rebuild it as in the days of old. He also promises that there will be incredible agricultural fertility. It's almost a reversal of the curse on the ground in the garden. The plowman will overtake the reaper, and the treader of grapes, him who sows the seed. That the one who's planting the seeds won't even be able to get the seed in the ground before it produces its fruit, and the reaper is able to get that fruit from it. And then finally, he promises that he's going to bring the people back to the land, that they will rebuild their lives in safety and security, and they will not be removed again. He says also, I will restore the captivity of my people Israel, and they will rebuild the ruined cities and live in them, and they will not again be rooted out from their land. Again, I think this probably falls into that small percentage that we have not seen yet. Seems as if he's referring to a time much later in the future. So not all of Amos is bad news. There is some good news at the very end of the book. Well, the last book that we're going to go over in Module 2 is the book of Hosea. We don't have a whole lot of time to go through it again, so we're just going to hit some of the more noteworthy parts of it after doing a little background. Now, Hosea's ministry is a little bit longer than Amos's is. The start date is toward the end of Jeroboam II's reign. Remember, Jeroboam II reigned from 786 to 746. It's still a time of relative prosperity, but they're beginning a period of decline. So we might say sometime around 750 BC. Now, the ending date, there is a reference in here to the Syro-Ephraimitic War that we talked about a little bit earlier, which occurred in 734. 711 talks about a policy of the last king of Israel, King Hoshea. And then 1316 anticipates a fall in the very near future. This, of course, happens in 722. So we can date Hosea's ministry between 750 and 723, sometime around then. Politically, things are similar, but a little worse than they were during the time of Amos. Political anarchy, 6 kings in the last 20 years of Israel. There's cursing, lying, murdering, stealing, adultery, violence. The leadership has failed. The kings, the priests, the government. It's a mess here during the last few years of Israel's history. Religiously, as we talked about before, there's meaningless ritual. The idolatry of the Canaanite god Baal is rampant. And there is this mixture of the worship of Baal with the worship of Yahweh, the Lord of Israel. Let's talk about what we know about Hosea the prophet. His name means Yahweh is salvation. It's the same root as Isaiah and Joshua and Jesus, Yeshua. Now, his home was in the northern kingdom. So unlike Amos, who was a native of the southern kingdom, preaching in the north, Hosea was a native of the north, preaching to his own people. Now we do know a little bit about his family. His father's name was Be'eri. We do know about his wife, and we'll talk a lot about her in just a second, Gomer. And we know that he had 3 children, whom we'll discuss here in just a second. Now, just to summarize the message of the book, it's similar to Amos, but there are also some differences as well. From Hosea's perspective, God's chief characteristic is love. The book of Hosea used 3 different Hebrew words for love. It uses ahav, it uses raham, and it also uses one of my favorite Hebrew words, chesed, a word for which there is no clear synonym with in English. This is strong, loyal love that expresses itself in action. We see this several different times in the book. Sometimes translations will use never-ending love, unending compassion, loving kindness, words like that, but really none of those captures the essence of what Hesed is. And that's just one of the 3 Hebrew words that he uses in the book. And it's because of this love that God has for Israel that he chose to have this unique relationship with them. And there's a couple of metaphors used to describe it. We're going to talk at length about the metaphor of a husband and a wife in chapters 1 through 3. But then he also uses the metaphor of a father and a son, a different type of love, but still a very committed and deep type of love. But, just like Amos reminded them, Israel's failed. They failed on their part of the love covenant. They failed, first of all, to know God. Now again, the love theme is very prevalent in the book, and this word know is used of a sexual, intimate knowledge. It's the same word that's used in Genesis chapter 4, verse 1, where it says that Adam knew his wife Eve, and she bore him a son. So there's a level of intimacy here that Israel has failed to live up to in their relationship with God. This has exhibited itself in idolatry, specifically the worship of the god Baal. And because of that, God is going to act toward Israel in the future in several ways. In the immediate future, he's going to act as their judge. He's going to be like dry rot to them. He's going to be a lion roaring against them, like a fowler, one who catches birds, catching Israel in a net. And yet, in a word of hope, in the distant future, God would be their restorer, their healer, and their provider. So, immediately, he's going to judge them, but there will be a day that he will restore them as well. Well, again, really the one passage that we have time to talk about is Hosea's tragic marriage in chapters 1, 2, and 3. And Hosea's marriage is really an image of Yahweh's relationship with Israel here. So we're introduced to Hosea's family, to his wife, and to his children. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is this is Hosea's earliest experience as a prophet. So this was his call. Like, this is the first time that he's ever heard from God before, and you have to feel kind of bad for him because God's first words to him are, Hosea, I want you to go marry an unfaithful woman. So in 1 verse 2, we read, when the Lord first spoke through Hosea, the Lord said to him, go take to yourself a wife of harlotry and have children of harlotry, for the land commits flagrant harlotry, forsaking the Lord. Not the greatest call experience there, is it? So, we are introduced to Hosea's wife, a woman named Gomer. She is his wife of harlotry. He marries her in obedience. Now, there is an interpretive issue here about Gomer, because some scholars don't like the idea of God calling Hosea to marry an impure woman. So, in an attempt to kind of soften that, some have suggested that she was fictional or metaphorical. It really doesn't read like that. It reads as if it is an actual occurrence. Now, the relationship between Hosea and Gomer is a metaphor for the relationship between God and Israel, but it seems as if it's a real relationship. Another option, and this is a very popular theory among those that don't like the idea that Gomer was a harlot when he married her, was that she was pure when they were married and that she was going to become a harlot later. The technical word for this is proleptically, that this speech, this proleptic type of speech, predicts something that's going to happen, but that hasn't happened yet. And then, of course, there is the more natural reading, and this is the one that I prefer, is that she was impure, perhaps a temple prostitute of Baal, as we talked about in Amos, that she left that life, but then eventually went back to it. Now, thankfully, our salvation and our eternity in heaven does not depend on what we believe about the identity of Gomer and whether or not she was pure when she married Hosea. So you can believe in any of these that you want to. You can write your paper on this if you want to, arguing one of these positions. However, for me, 3 seems to have the biggest impact and the greatest metaphorical punch to it. So they have 3 children, and these children are the children of harlotry, as we'll talk about in just a second. And God equates harlotry with idolatry because he says the people of Israel in the land have committed a great harlotry to him. In other words, they have played the harlot by running after these other gods. So let's talk about Hosea's kids here for just a second, the children of harlotry. Well, he has 3 kids. The first child is a little boy, and God tells Hosea to name the boy Jezreel. Now, this is a name that in Hebrew means God sows. This is a word of agriculture and fertility. It might be similar to naming a child Summer or Autumn. It's a plain there in northern Israel, but it's also a city up there. The ancient city of Jezreel. And northern Israel is very lush, very green, very fertile. And so this automatically would conjure up images of that area that was very lush and very green. But that's not really what the name means, because the name is talking about God sowing judgment on his people. That's what the name Jezreel is to symbolize. And the prediction is that the dynasty of King Jehu is going to come to an end, which is Jeroboam II is part of Jehu's dynasty. And ultimately this happens when Tiglath-Pileser devastates the Israelite army there at Jezreel, the very location that the boy's name symbolizes. She conceived, she being Gomer, and bore him, Hosea, a son. And the Lord said to him, name him Jezreel for a little while, and I will punish the house of Jehu for the bloodshed of Jezreel, and I'll put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. So not the best name for a little boy, and not a great prediction for Israel. Well, they have a second child, a little girl this time, and the little girl is to be named Lo Ruhamah. And this name means no love, based on the root word raham, which means compassion or kindness or love. And the prediction is that God is going to stop showing mercy to Israel. Judah, however, the southern kingdom, is exempted from this. So the little girl, their second child, she conceived again and gave birth to a daughter. And the Lord said to Hosea, name her Lo Ruhamah, for I will no longer have compassion on the house of Israel, that I would ever forgive them. So the names are not getting better here. We've moved from God sowing judgment to no love. And then the third child is named Lo Ami. And this in Hebrew means not my people. This is a direct reference to the covenant that God made with Israel at Mount Sinai. Exodus 6:7, God says, you will be my people and I will be your God. But now, with this name, it's Lo Ami, not my people. And the prediction is that Israel will no longer be the people of God. So when Gomer had weaned Lo Ruhamah, she conceived and gave birth to a son. And the Lord said, name him Lo Ami, for you are not my people, and I am not your God. I want to put this in context for just a second, because I think sometimes we forget that the prophets were real people. And Hosea was a real person. And he married this woman, presumably taking her out of a lifestyle of sexual impurity. And they had a son. And what should have been the most exciting time in their relationship was not that exciting, because the child's name was to be God sows. And then the second child was symbolic of their deteriorating relationship, because that child's name is no love. And then the last child's name is not mine. And we don't even really know if the second and third child were Hosea's, because it says for Jezreel that she conceived and gave him a son, but here it just says she conceived and gave birth to a son. The same thing with Lo Ruhamah. So we didn't even know if they're Hosea's children or not. And you have to imagine that Hosea was disappointed and sad as a result of this. And he must have said to God, God, why would you do such a thing to me? Why would you make me go through such pain? You don't understand what I'm going through. And at that very moment, God would say to him, oh, yes, I do. I know exactly what it's like when someone you love is unfaithful to you, because my people have been unfaithful to me since the beginning. Now, Hosea, I want you to go and tell my people about how I feel about them being unfaithful to me. So Hosea's relationship with his wife and his kids was a symbol. It was an analogy of God's relationship with Israel. So Hosea's marriage to unfaithful Gomer is a metaphor of God's experience with unfaithful Israel. Through the names of the children, God is going to judge Israel by these three steps. He's going to end the ruling dynasty, the dynasty of Jehu. He's going to end forgiveness, no love, he tells them in the second child, and he's going to suspend the covenant, that they will not be his people until they repent. Well, even if the story ended there, we would still get the idea of what God was trying to say. But thankfully, the story doesn't end there. In chapter 3, the story continues, in my opinion anyway. Chapter 3 says, the Lord said to me, it's first person now, go again, love a woman who is loved by her husband, yet an adulteress, even as the Lord loves the sons of Israel, though they turn to other gods and love raisin cakes. So I bought her for myself for 15 shekels of silver and a homer and a half of barley. Well, so the big question here is this a sequel to chapters 1 and 2? In other words, is the woman in this story Gomer that Hosea is buying back? It doesn't mention Gomer by name here as it does in chapters 1 and 2. But in my estimation, this is a sequel. Some have suggested, however, that it's a retelling of chapter 1 in first person. That chapter 1 tells the story in third person, whereas chapter 3 is Hosea's version of that because it's in first person. And then still others say that this is a second marriage to a different woman. To me, that isn't a real possibility simply because it says go again or go now and love a woman. So it seems to me, and again, you can believe whatever you want to here and argue whichever one you want to if you want to write a paper on this. It seems as if the best interpretation is that this is a sequel of the love story between Hosea and Gomer. And a beautiful picture of God redeeming the unfaithful. Just as Hosea redeems his unfaithful wife, God is going to redeem unfaithful Israel. Because Hosea does buy her back for 15 shekels and a homer and a half of barley. A homer is a measure of barley. Now, this is a high price to pay, especially for someone who Hosea already owns. Now, sorry, ladies, but in that culture, women were bought and sold like property, much like slaves. And so Hosea technically already owned her as his wife. So for him to actually have to buy her again, anything he would have to pay would be a lot. But Hosea also takes the woman, presumably Gomer, back home with him, and he locks the door and he says, all right, this is going to stop now. I'm going to rid you of this desire to run and chase after other lovers and other relationships. And in the same way, presumably through the exile, Israel's going to be deprived of all the things upon which they have come to depend. And during this time, they will return to Yahweh. Afterwards, the sons of Israel will return and seek the Lord their God and David their king, and they will come trembling to the Lord and to his goodness in the last days. And so it talks about how they're going to be taken away from the king and the government. And during that time, they're going to turn back their eyes to the Lord. Well, as we finish this, just some theological truths regarding God's love here in chapters 1 through 3. First of all, it's a love that creates a unique covenant relationship. God created a covenant with Israel because he loved them. And from a New Testament perspective, Jesus Christ is the mediator of the new covenant that God creates with us, again, because he loves us. This is a love that continues in spite of unfaithfulness. And aren't you thankful that God is better at loving us than we are at turning away from him? And ultimately, it disciplines in order to restore faithfulness. Just as Hosea brought his wife home and locked the door and said, no more. Many times that's what God has to do with us. And then it acts in redemption to restore the broken covenant. Well, we don't know whatever happened between Hosea and Gomer. After chapter 3, there's no mention of their relationship in the book. I would like to think that they stayed together and they worked things out and they raised their 3 children together, but we simply don't know. But what we do know is that their relationship is an analogy and symbolic of the relationship between God and Israel during this terrible time. Well, there's a lot more good stuff in Hosea that we're not going to have time to talk about, so feel free to watch another video lecture, listen to another audio lecture, read some articles about the book of Hosea. Write your paper on the book of Hosea if you want to do that. Amos as well. But thanks so much for hanging in there during Module 2, and I'll look forward to seeing you in Module number 3. Thanks.